She had nothing but a plastic bag and a worn coat when he found her by the tracks, shivering in the cold, kicked out by her own son. He didn't ask questions. He just reached out his hand. What happened next would change everything. Before we begin this unforgettable story about kindness, second chances, and the unexpected power of doing the right thing, if you love stories that warm your heart and make you believe in goodness again, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Now, let's begin. Single dad helped an elderly woman, kicked out by her own son, but she was hiding $1.8 million. The house sat quiet behind her, a beautiful stone cottage with ivy climbing the walls and flower beds that once bloomed under her care. But now, Margaret Whitmore gripped the leather handles of 2 old suitcases with trembling hands, her breath shallow in the crisp Wyoming air. She didn't look back. The front door had already closed. Behind that door stood her son Kyle, arms folded across his chest, watching through the window without a trace of guilt. Beside him, his wife Lindsay wore a look of relief as if shedding an old burden. Margaret's shoes sank slightly into the gravel of the long, winding driveway. Her steps were slow but purposeful, as though dignity alone carried her forward. The suitcases were heavy not just with clothes but with all that was left of a life that had been quietly dismantled behind her back. No words had been spoken. No goodbyes. Just a short, bitter conversation 2 nights earlier that had ended with Kyle's flat statement, "It's time, Mom. You can't live here anymore. We need the space," as if she were furniture, as if 38 years of motherhood and sacrifice amounted to an inconvenience. The wind stung her eyes, or maybe it was something else. She kept walking. The main road was still a good half-mile ahead. She had no destination, no plan. But she refused to sit there and watch Kyle and Lindsay remodel her memories. A pickup truck rounded the curve, slowing as it approached the bend where Margaret now stood, visibly shaking. The truck was dusty, its paint chipped and its tires worn thin, but it came to a stop with careful precision. From the driver's seat, a man leaned out, early 40s, in a fleece-lined work jacket and a Red Sox cap. His beard was peppered with gray, his eyes shadowed by the kind of exhaustion that lingers beyond just one sleepless night. Yet, when he looked at her, his face softened. "Ma'am, do you need help?" Margaret looked up, the sunlight catching the corner of her glasses. She hesitated. She started, voice cracking. "I can give you a ride," he offered, gently stepping out of the truck. "Just to town or wherever you're going." She looked back just once at the house. No one watched from the window anymore. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That would be kind." He took one suitcase, then the other, placing them gently in the bed of the truck. She moved slowly around the side, climbing into the passenger seat as though every joint in her body had to renegotiate its role. "I'm Ethan," he said once they were both seated. "Margaret." They rode in silence for a few minutes. Gravel turned to pavement. Trees blurred past in solemn lines. Ethan didn't press her, and Margaret didn't offer details. But when they reached the old railroad, crossing rusted signs, cracked wood slats long unused, she broke the silence. "I built that house," she murmured, barely above a whisper. "Stone by stone. Every bush in the garden I planted myself. Kyle was born in the upstairs bedroom. And now, I'm not welcome in it." Ethan glanced at her, his knuckles tightening subtly around the wheel. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," because sometimes sorrow was too complicated for simple phrases. "You're welcome to rest at my place for a bit," he said instead. "Nothing fancy, but there's heat and coffee. My boy's at school right now." She turned to him, truly seeing his face for the first time. Kind eyes. Tired, but kind. "You don't know me," she said, surprised. He shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Looks like you needed someone." They pulled into the driveway of a modest ranch-style home tucked between a chain-link fence and an aging maple tree. A small basketball hoop tilted over the garage. Toys sat piled in a corner of the porch. The lawn wasn't perfect, but it was swept. Lived in. Margaret stepped out slowly. Ethan unloaded her suitcases, carrying them up the steps without a word. Inside, the house smelled faintly of old books and cinnamon. The heater buzzed softly. A quilt lay folded neatly on the couch, and a framed drawing of a dog, childlike charming, hung on the refrigerator. "You can rest here," Ethan said, gesturing to the couch. "Noah, my son, usually does his homework there, but he won't mind." Margaret stood still for a moment. "I insist on paying you something," she said, "even if it's just for the night." Ethan shook his head. "Not necessary. I wasn't raised to take charity. I wasn't raised to let someone freeze on the side of the road." Their eyes met in a brief moment of mutual stubbornness. Then Margaret exhaled slow and long, like she was releasing something she'd held too long inside. She sat down, gingerly placing her hands on her lap. "I taught art," she said, more to herself than to him. 32 years. Children used to run into my classroom like it was the sunniest place in the school. Ethan pulled up a kitchen chair nearby. "What happened?" She looked down at her fingers. Life got noisy. I got quiet. And somewhere in that silence I lost track of the people I loved. The front door creaked. "Dad," a boy's voice, clear, uncertain. "In here, buddy." A slender boy appeared, backpack half-zipped, cheeks pink from the wind. He paused when he saw Margaret blinking curiously. "This is Miss Margaret Ethan," said. "She's our guest." Noah walked forward, offered a small, polite wave. "Hi." "Hello," Margaret said, softly, offering him a warm, grandmotherly smile. Noah looked at her suitcases. "Are you staying long?" Margaret looked to Ethan, then back to the boy. "I'm not sure," she said, "but maybe. Just long enough." Outside, a wind picked up again, rustling the leaves across the porch. But inside the house felt just a little warmer. The next morning, light filtered through the pale curtains, brushing against the frayed edge of the couch where Margaret had slept. She opened her eyes slowly, half expecting to see the high ceiling of her former bedroom, the familiar creak of the window pane she loved to oil in spring. But this room was different, smaller, cluttered, real. The faint scent of burnt toast and cheap coffee wafted in from the kitchen. Somewhere nearby, a boy was humming off-key. She sat up, carefully smoothing her sweater and glancing around. A folded blanket lay over her shoulders. Someone had tucked it there during the night. In the kitchen, Ethan stood at the stove, flipping something in a skillet with one hand while balancing a lunchbox with the other. Noah sat at the table, his feet swinging a half-drawn robot in front of him. Margaret stepped in slowly, her presence quiet, but not unnoticed. "Morning," Ethan said without turning. "Hope the couch treated you all right." "It did," she replied, her voice still a little raspy. "More comfortable than you'd think." Ethan glanced over his shoulder. "I make bad eggs and worse coffee, but you're welcome to both." She smiled, though faintly. "You've already done more than enough." He handed her a mug anyway. Then, "What's one more cup?" She accepted it, cradling the warmth in her hands. Her eyes landed on the calendar pinned crookedly to the fridge. April. Her wedding anniversary had passed last week. Kyle hadn't remembered. She hadn't reminded him. Noah, sensing a shift in the air, looked up. "Miss Margaret, do you like robots?" She blinked, surprised by the question. "I suppose I've never given it much thought." He turned the paper around, proudly presenting his sketch. A lopsided machine with a heroic cape laser eyes and, most endearingly, an apron. "He's a cooking robot," Noah explained. "He protects kitchens and makes pancakes." Margaret chuckled. "Now that's a robot I can support." Ethan gave a half-smile as he packed Noah's bag. "He's been designing that one since Tuesday. Says it'll make breakfasts while I sleep." "Because you work too much," Noah added matter-of-factly. Ethan ruffled his son's hair. "I work just enough, thanks." Margaret watched them, feeling a strange ache in her chest. Not pain exactly, but a kind of longing she hadn't expected to feel again. This wasn't her family, but something about the easy rhythm of their morning felt comforting. Real. When Noah left for school, Backpack bouncing drawing, clutched in hand, Margaret stood in the hallway with her hands folded neatly in front of her. "I'd like to pay you something," she said quietly. Ethan turned. For what? For the couch, the coffee, the safety, everything. He leaned against the counter, crossed his arms. "Margaret, it's not a boarding house. You're welcome here." She stiffened slightly. "I don't take charity. I don't offer it," he replied. "I just saw someone who needed help." She met his eyes, then truly looked. The sincerity in his voice disarmed her, but she couldn't let go of the discomfort coiling inside her. "It's not about pride," she said. "It's about being able to look at myself in the mirror." Ethan nodded slowly as if weighing that. Then, with an almost boyish shrug, he said, "Fine. You can make dinner tonight. That's payment enough." Margaret blinked, taken aback. "I warn you," he added, "Noah's a picky eater." "Challenge accepted," she said. They both smiled for the first time, not out of politeness but genuine connection. The afternoon passed in a quiet rhythm. Ethan worked in the garage on a neighbor's old Buick. Margaret wandered the small house, memorizing its details. There was a shelf near the window lined with hand-painted stones labeled with dates. One said Noah's first day of school, 2019. Another, Mom's birthday. Rained all day. She didn't ask about that one. In the kitchen, she opened the cabinets methodically, inspecting what was available. Flour, a small bag of rice, a can of tomatoes dented. It wasn't much, but she had learned how to stretch a meal when her husband got sick and bills outweighed groceries. She worked quietly, kneading dough, simmering herbs. Her hands knew what to do. By the time Ethan stepped inside, the house smelled like rosemary and something he couldn't quite name, but it reminded him of Sundays before everything fell apart. He paused in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. "What is that chicken pot pie?" "Kind of." She glanced at the pie crust with modest pride, with some improvisation. Noah burst through the front door moments later, dropping his backpack with a thud. "It smells like Thanksgiving." They ate at the small kitchen table, the three of them crammed in tight, but laughing. Noah asked Margaret about art, about what it was like to be a teacher. Ethan mostly listened, watching how his son lit up in her presence, how Margaret's face softened each time Noah spoke. After dinner, Ethan stood to clear the table. Margaret reached for the plates, but he stopped her. "You already paid," he said, with interest. She looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. That night, Margaret sat alone in the living room as Ethan tucked Noah in. She stared out the window toward the street, where shadows played across the pavement. Somewhere beyond that road was a house built with her own two hands, and a son who no longer saw her as anything but a burden. But in this small home among the mismatched chairs and squeaky floorboards, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Worth. And for the first time since the front door slammed behind her, she let her hand rest on the armrest, leaned her head back, and whispered to herself, "You're still here." And she was. It rained softly the next morning, the kind of spring drizzle that made the porch smell like old wood and wet earth. Margaret stood by the window in the living room, her tea cooling in her hand, watching the raindrops race each other down the glass. The world outside was gray and quiet, gentle, almost forgiving. She hadn't slept much. Too many thoughts moved through her mind like shadows underwater. Still, there was a peace to this small house that soothed something inside her she hadn't realized was wounded. The silence here didn't feel heavy. It felt like breathing space. She turned when she heard the soft creak of a chair. Noah sat at the kitchen table, hunched over his sketch pad. His tongue peeked from the corner of his mouth in that way children have when they're fully focused, unaware of the world. The table was scattered with crayons, pencils, and scraps of old newspaper. Margaret crossed the room and peered over his shoulder. The boy had drawn a tree, tall, full, with crooked branches and a little swing hanging from the lowest limb. "That's beautiful," she said. Noah looked up, startled. "It's not done. I'm still figuring out how to draw wind." She smiled. "Draw the leaves in motion. Let the branches lean into the breeze. Art is less about what things are and more about what they feel like. Noah blinked at her, absorbing every word. "Did you really teach kids?" he asked. "For a long time," she said, lowering herself into the chair beside him. "Back when chalk dust was a badge of honor and glue sticks weren't locked in drawers." He grinned. "You know," she continued, "I used to make picture books with my students. No words, just drawings that told a story." "Really?" Noah's eyes lit up. She nodded. "Sometimes stories say more when you don't fill in every blank." He flipped to a blank page. "Can we make one?" Margaret hesitated. Her hands were stiffer than they used to be, her lines less precise, but the boy's excitement was contagious. "All right," she said, reaching for a pencil. "What should it be about a robot who finds something he didn't know he lost?" Noah said without pause. Margaret turned to him, surprised. "And what does he find?" Noah shrugged, eyes darting away. "Maybe a friend." She said nothing at first, just placed her hand gently on his, guiding his fingers to sketch the outline of a robot standing under a street lamp. Later that morning, while Noah was at school, Margaret sat on the couch flipping through her purse. She was looking for a spare set of reading glasses when she came across a photo slipped between two folded napkins. It was old corners worn. The image showed a much younger Margaret at a county fair, one arm around a teenage girl with auburn hair and a reluctant smile. Behind them, a Ferris wheel turned beneath a blue summer sky. Claire. The name still caught in her chest like a breath that wouldn't fully leave. Margaret stared at the picture for a long time, her fingers tracing the faint smudge along the edge where it had been handled too often. She remembered that day how Claire had asked to leave early, how Margaret had said, "Don't be ungrateful," instead of asking what was wrong. She had been so focused on holding her family together that she hadn't realized it was already falling apart. A sudden knock pulled her from the memory. Ethan stood in the doorway, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. "Truck's acting up again," he said. "Fuel line's loose." "You run a shop?" she asked, folding the photo back into her wallet. He shook his head. "Not really. Just fix what I can to keep things going." She looked at him for a moment, then said gently, "You're a good father." Ethan seemed caught off guard. He glanced down at the rag. "I try. It's hard. Some days I think I'm doing all right. Other days I wonder if Noah's just being strong because he has no other choice. That's how most kids survive," Margaret said quietly. He sat across from her, the distance between them filled with unspoken understanding. "You ever hear from his mom?" she asked, not out of curiosity but compassion. "She left when Noah was 5, he said. Said she couldn't be a mom. Said I made it look too easy and that made her feel worse." Margaret didn't judge. She simply nodded, her gaze soft. She signed over everything. Ethan continued. "Haven't seen her since." "And you've done all this alone?" she asked. "Most days," he said. "Some days I get lucky. Like when someone walks into your life and makes chicken pot pie out of canned soup and magic." Margaret laughed, a small warm sound that filled the quiet kitchen. "I'm not magic," she said. "You're something," Ethan replied, then added, "Noah likes you. That's rare. He's not big on new people." She looked down at the photo again and then made a decision. "I wasn't a great mother," she said. "Not always. I let fear lead me more than love sometimes. I think I lost my daughter because of that." Ethan didn't push, he just let her speak. "She told me something once, something horrible, and instead of protecting her, I questioned her. I was afraid of what it would mean if she was telling the truth." Ethan's expression didn't change, but his shoulders straightened just slightly. "Was she?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "Yes." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that made room for honesty. "I think about her every day," Margaret said, "but I never found the courage to reach out." Ethan leaned forward. "Maybe now's the time." She looked at him, and there was something in his face, an openness, an unflinching kindness that made her believe for the first time in a long while that healing was possible, that maybe not everything broken had to stay that way. Later that night, Noah presented her with their picture book. It was only 6 pages long, rough, crooked, and perfect. "It's not finished," he said. Margaret smiled. "Neither are we." It was almost sunset when Ethan came home from a long afternoon repairing Mrs. Calhoun's busted lawnmower. The sky outside was painted in streaks of orange and fading blue, casting a warm glow through the house's worn windows. He kicked off his boots at the door, rolled his shoulders, and headed for the kitchen. The scent of something sweet filled the air, apple cobbler maybe. He smiled. Margaret was baking again. Noah was at the table bent over the now 10-page robot picture book while Margaret stood at the counter carefully spooning filling into a crust. Her cardigan was dusted with flour, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her eyes focused. "I could get used to coming home to this," Ethan said, light-hearted but sincere. Margaret looked up startled at first, then smiled as she wiped her hands. "Just trying to earn my keep." Noah looked up beaming. "She taught me how to make dough from scratch. It's like Play-Doh, but it turns into pie." Ethan chuckled and set his bag down. "Sounds like she's spoiling us both." Margaret tilted her head amused. "You say that like it's a bad thing." They shared a look, something unspoken but not uncomfortable. Familiar. As Margaret reached for a towel to clean her hands, something slipped from her apron pocket, a photograph. It fluttered to the floor landing, face up. Ethan bent to pick it up. It was the photo from the fair, the one with a younger Margaret and a teenage girl standing close together, arms linked. The background was a swirl of carnival lights and summer joy. The girl's smile was hesitant, her eyes uncertain, but she was clearly loved. Clearly someone. Ethan studied it. "Is this your daughter?" Margaret froze. Her expression shifted, just a flicker but enough to betray something deeper than surprise. Something raw. "Yes," she said softly, her hands now clasped together. "That's Claire." Noah stood and leaned in. "She looks nice." "She was," Margaret replied. "Is. I don't know where she is now." Ethan returned the photo carefully. "You want to talk about her?" Margaret paused. Then slowly she sat at the table, smoothing the corners of the picture like it might break. Claire was strong from the day she was born. She always asked questions, always challenged rules. She wasn't trying to rebel. She just saw the world in ways I didn't understand. "Sounds like someone I know," Ethan said, nodding toward Noah, who grinned proudly. Margaret smiled faintly. Then her expression clouded. "One summer, Claire told me something no mother ever wants to hear, something terrifying, and instead of holding her, instead of believing her, she trailed off." I froze. I doubted her. Ethan didn't interrupt. He waited his silence an invitation rather than a burden. "She said her stepfather had touched her, that he made her feel unsafe in our home. And Margaret's voice cracked. I was so afraid of destroying what was left of our family, I told her we'd talk about it later. I never talked about it again." The room fell into a hush so quiet they could hear the ticking of the wall clock. I thought I was protecting her by keeping things normal. I thought time would soften what she said. But she left 2 weeks later. 17, a suitcase, and silence. I haven't heard her voice since. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Do you think she'd want to hear from you now? I've wondered," Margaret said. "Every year, every birthday, every Christmas. I've picked up the phone 100 times. But what do you say after that much time? Sorry I didn't protect you. It's not enough. It'll never be enough." Noah was quiet listening. At 9, he understood more than most adults thought possible. He reached over and gently touched Margaret's hand. "Sometimes people just need to hear something." Margaret looked at him, eyes glassy. "She's successful now," she added quietly. "I read her name once in a regional business article. She runs a company. Real estate or consulting, I don't know. She changed her last name, moved across the state." Ethan's brows lifted. She's in Wyoming. Margaret nodded. Somewhere near Casper, I think. Ethan stood, walked to the counter, and poured her a glass of water. Then, it's not impossible. She chuckled dryly. That's a dangerous word. Impossible. I said that about being kicked out of my own home, too. He handed her the glass. And yet, here you are, still standing, still making cobbler. Noah chimed in, and teaching me about robots. Margaret laughed gently through the sadness. And making a mess of your kitchen. Ethan glanced at the photo again. You still love her. I never stopped. Then maybe he said, his voice steady, it's time she hears that. The oven timer dinged. Margaret stood and wiped her eyes, then walked to the stove and removed the cobbler with steady hands. The smell of cinnamon and apple filled the room. A quiet comfort. After dinner, when the dishes were done and Noah was asleep, Ethan stepped outside to take a call. Margaret lingered in the living room holding the photograph. She sat on the couch and whispered into the stillness. I'm sorry, Claire. I should have believed you. I should have been your voice when you lost yours. In her lap, the picture trembled slightly. She pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. Upstairs, Ethan looked at his phone. Something Margaret said lingered in his mind. A regional business article. He opened his browser and typed Claire Whitmore plus Wyoming plus real estate. The second result caught his eye. C. Whitmore & Co. Boutique Property Consultancy, Casper, WY. Underneath a press photo of a poised professional woman with auburn hair. He stared at it for a long time, then looked toward the staircase where Margaret sat below, unaware. He didn't know what he would do yet, but he had a feeling the next chapter of Margaret's life was about to begin, ready or not. The next morning arrived with a strange stillness. No birdsong, no wind, just a kind of hush, as if the world had paused to inhale. Margaret stood in the kitchen early, already preparing breakfast. She needed something to do with her hands. Her thoughts had churned all night. The photo sat folded on the windowsill. Claire's half-smile haunted her, not with anger, but with a question that refused to fade. Why didn't you fight for me? Down the hall, Noah's sleepy footsteps padded closer. He rubbed his eyes and gave a soft good morning, which Margaret answered with a warm hug and a plate of scrambled eggs. Ethan followed soon after, tousle-haired, still in his work boots, but before he could reach the coffee pot, a sound made them all freeze. A vehicle, a large one. The rumble of a high-end engine pulled into the gravel driveway. Margaret moved to the window, instinctively clutching her hands together. Ethan came up behind her. An SUV, black, polished, clearly expensive, rolled to a stop in front of the house. The chrome grille gleamed beneath the morning sun. For a long, long moment, no one opened the door. Then it did. A woman stepped out. Late 30s, maybe 40. Slim build, dressed in a tailored blazer and dark jeans. Her auburn hair tied neatly back shimmered as she turned her head toward the house. Sharp eyes, measured steps, no hesitation. Margaret gasped, her knees buckling slightly. Ethan caught her elbow. Is that... Yes, she whispered. Claire. Noah peeked from behind the couch, wide-eyed. Is that your daughter? Margaret nodded slowly. She came. Ethan didn't ask how Claire had found them. He already knew. Claire approached the porch with the stance of someone used to walking into rooms where she wasn't sure if she was welcome, but who no longer waited for permission. Her heels clicked against the wooden steps like the ticking of a countdown. Ethan opened the door before she knocked. Claire, he said gently. Her gaze flicked over him, then past him. I'm here for my mother. Margaret stepped into view. Her voice trembled. Hello, Claire. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Claire's lips parted, not with a smile, not yet, but with breath. I thought you were dead, she said flatly, or that I might never see you again. And then a neighbor called, said you'd been kicked out. Margaret flinched, shame flooding her face. Claire's voice was calm but tight. So I drove 5 hours to confirm that my mother, the woman who didn't believe me when I needed her most, is now living in a stranger's home. Ethan stepped back. You're welcome inside, if you'd like to talk. Claire looked around the modest home. She hesitated before stepping in. Her heels clicked across the hardwood. Her eyes scanned everything: the small kitchen, the couch with the folded blanket, the drawings on the fridge. Her gaze landed on Noah. He stood tall like a soldier guarding his fort, determined not to let anyone hurt Margaret. Claire softened just a bit. You must be Noah. Yes, ma'am. Ethan gestured to the table. Would you like some coffee? I didn't come here for coffee, Claire said. I did, Margaret replied, voice fragile but firm. Would you sit with me while I have mine? Claire looked at her mother. For a second, just a second, the hard edge in her face cracked. She nodded and sat. The silence at the table was thick. I've never asked you for anything, Claire began. Not since I left. I know Margaret said. Claire looked at her, arms crossed. Then why now? Why show up in someone's home vulnerable after decades of silence? You couldn't call me when I was starting my life. You couldn't apologize when I opened my first office. But now, Margaret swallowed. Because I didn't deserve you then? Claire blinked, thrown off. I didn't know how to face you. I thought I was protecting the family, but I see now I was protecting myself. I failed you, Claire. And I live with that every single day. The words settled between them, raw and heavy. Claire's eyes shimmered, but her jaw stayed tight. I didn't come here for an apology. Then why did you come? Claire looked away. Because, even after everything, you're still my mother. And when I heard what Kyle did, how he put you out like you were nothing, I realized I needed to see you, with my own eyes. Margaret's hands trembled in her lap. I was nothing to him. I let it happen. I gave him power over my life because I thought I had to. And when he turned me out, her voice cracked. I didn't even fight. Claire's hand flinched as if it wanted to reach across the table but didn't know how. I'm not proud of the choices I made, Margaret continued, but I'm trying to make different ones now, even if it's too late. Claire finally looked her in the eyes. It's not too late. It's just not easy. Margaret nodded. I don't expect you to forgive me. I only hope to deserve your time. A long pause followed. Then Noah, in his honest, childlike way, blurted out, She made me a robot picture book. Claire blinked, startled. A what? A picture book, with drawings. It doesn't have words, but it says a lot. Claire looked at her mother, who smiled with watery eyes. Some stories are better without words. Another silence passed. Then Claire slowly stood. I'll stay tonight, but I'll need to find a place nearby after that. You're welcome here, Ethan said quietly. She glanced at him. You always bring strangers into your home. No, he said, but some people stop being strangers the moment they walk in. Claire didn't respond, but her expression softened just slightly. As the sun lowered outside, casting gold across the floorboards, the house exhaled. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Claire sat across from her again. And for the first time in 2 decades, mother and daughter shared the same room under the same roof, breathing the same quiet hope. It wasn't reconciliation. Not yet. But it was a beginning. The house was quieter than usual that evening. Even Noah, usually a storm of curiosity and energy, had retreated to his room early, sensing a change in the atmosphere. Ethan had offered to make dinner, but Claire politely declined, opting instead for a long walk around the block to clear her head. Margaret understood. Now the 2 women sat across from each other in the dimly lit living room. The television was off. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock that hung slightly crooked above the mantel. Margaret's teacup sat untouched in her lap. Claire nursed a glass of water, fingers slowly tracing the rim. I didn't expect to feel anything, Claire finally said. Her voice was steady but low. I thought I'd walk in, see you, and feel nothing. Maybe a little pity. But instead she broke off. I felt 12 years old again, angry, small. Margaret nodded slowly. I felt that too. About myself? Claire looked up, startled. What do you mean? Margaret hesitated. Then she took a breath so deep it trembled in her chest. I remember the night you told me, about what he did. Claire's jaw tightened. I was 16. You were brave, Margaret whispered. No, Claire said sharply. I was terrified, and I had to be the adult in that moment. I had to be the one who spoke the truth, and I spoke it to the one person I thought would protect me. Margaret swallowed hard. And I failed you. Claire didn't reply. She didn't need to. The silence spoke volumes. I went into denial. Margaret continued. Complete, blinding denial. He was gone so much by then. Working late, traveling. I told myself I'd misunderstood. That you had misunderstood. That maybe you were exaggerating. I wasn't, Claire said. You know that now. I do. I knew it then, too deep down. But I couldn't face it. Her voice cracked. I was afraid. Of losing the life we'd built. Of breaking everything apart. And so, I stayed silent. And by doing that, I lost you. Claire looked away. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked rapidly, refusing to let them fall. I used to wait for you to call, she said. For years. On my birthday, holidays, graduation. I told myself every year, this is the one. She'll reach out. But the silence kept growing until I convinced myself, you must have chosen him. No, Margaret said firmly. I didn't choose him. I chose fear. And I have regretted it every single day since. Claire's voice broke slightly. Then why didn't you come for me? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then, softly. Because shame is louder than love when you let it grow unchecked. The words hung between them like thick fog. And yet, something shifted in Claire's face. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. Maybe the beginning of empathy. Margaret leaned forward, hands shaking slightly. I kept your letters, every one, even after you stopped sending them. I read them until the ink faded. Claire frowned. You never responded. I didn't know how. What could I say that wouldn't sound like an excuse or worse, pity? You could have said, I believe you now. That would have been enough. Margaret's breath caught. I believe you, Claire. I believed you too late, but I do. I did. And I am so sorry for every second I made you carry that pain alone. Claire's shoulders stiffened. She turned away, swiping at her cheek. You sound different now. Margaret nodded. Because I am. Being discarded by your son has a way of teaching you what you refuse to learn. Kyle used me for years, and I let him because I thought it made up for losing you. But all it did was make the loss permanent. Claire stared at her, silent. I came here because I had nowhere left to go, Margaret continued. But staying, that was because of Ethan and Noah, and because I started to see myself as more than the mother who failed. I started to believe I might still have something left to offer. Claire's eyes softened. You do. Margaret let out a long, shaky breath. They sat like that for several minutes. Two women, once mother and daughter, then strangers, now something tentative in between. I don't know if I can forgive you, Claire said honestly. Not yet. I understand, Margaret said. Forgiveness isn't a door you walk through. It's a path. I'll walk it as long as you let me. Claire let her gaze drop to the floor. Then she nodded. Slowly. Margaret rose from her chair and stepped toward the old bookcase in the corner. She pulled out a folder, worn and faded, and handed it to Claire. Inside were drawings, letters, school certificates, all Claire's, even a tiny scrap of cloth, part of her first dance recital dress. I couldn't throw them away, Margaret said. Claire opened the folder, fingers grazing the familiar paper. Her lips trembled. I used to think you forgot me, she whispered. Margaret's eyes filled. I could never. There in the quiet, something passed between them. Not a healing, not yet, but a mending. A seam, stitched even if the fabric was still thin. Just then the door creaked open. Ethan appeared holding 2 mugs of tea. "Didn't mean to interrupt," he said softly. Claire turned toward him, and for the first time her voice carried warmth. "You didn't." He handed them the mugs and sat in the chair beside Margaret. Claire sipped slowly. "Your house feels different than I expected." Ethan chuckled. "Most things do once you're inside." Claire looked over at Margaret, her eyes steady now. "I'll stay through the weekend. We can talk more then." Margaret's lips trembled. "I'd like that very much." The wall clock ticked. The rain had started again outside. But inside the house something had shifted quietly, permanently. A corner turned. A wound not yet healed but no longer ignored. Forgiveness might take time. But love, Margaret realized, was a decision you made every day, even if you'd failed the day before. Saturday morning broke with a promise of sunshine and the scent of strong coffee. Ethan was already outside his boots, crunching against the gravel as he adjusted a tarp over a half-repaired sedan. It had rained during the night, and the dampness still clung to the air. Inside the house, Noah and Margaret sat at the kitchen table bent over a new page of their wordless picture book. Claire stood in the doorway, a mug of tea in hand, silently watching them both. The tenderness of the moment, and the quiet skill with which Margaret guided the boy's hand across the page. She didn't say anything. Instead, she turned and walked through the screen door, letting it close gently behind her. Ethan looked up from beneath the hood of the car, wiping his hands on a towel slung over his shoulder. "Sleep. Okay." Claire nodded, hugging her mug. "Better than I expected. Your couch has more personality than half the hotels I've stayed in." He chuckled. "It sags a bit, but it's honest." They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, the sun climbing slowly above the rooftops of the sleepy town. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance. Claire took a sip of tea. "Can I ask you something?" she said, glancing sideways at him. "Shoot. Why did you let her stay?" Her tone wasn't accusatory, just genuinely curious. A stranger? No background check. No guarantees. Ethan leaned against the truck arms, folded, thinking. "Honestly, I saw someone who needed help. Someone who reminded me of my mom in her last years. Tired, proud, but still fighting to keep something inside from breaking." Claire looked down at her mug. A lot of people would have looked the other way. "I've been on the other side of the other way," he said simply. "When Noah's mom left, things got real quiet around here. People don't know what to do with men who raise kids alone. They assume you'll fail. Some even hope you will." Claire studied him for a moment. "But you didn't." He smiled faintly. "Noah gave me something to show up for. Every day, even when I didn't feel like I had anything left to give." Claire took another sip, then glanced back toward the house. "She's changed," she said. "My mother. There's still guilt under her skin, but she's softer, like something cracked open." Ethan nodded. "I've seen it." "I didn't think I'd feel anything but anger when I saw her again," Claire admitted. "But then I saw her teaching Noah to draw a kite, and I couldn't breathe for a second. It was like seeing a version of her I only remembered in pieces." "She's trying," Ethan said. "I don't think she knows how to fix the past, but she's not running from it anymore." Claire nodded slowly, then turned to him. "What about you?" He raised an eyebrow. "What about me?" "You took us both in. Me, with all my suspicion. Her, with all her pain. And you never asked why. Why we were broken. Why we stayed." Ethan smiled, but it was gentle, almost sad. "Some people ask because they're curious. Others ask because they need reasons to walk away. I don't ask because I believe in showing up first. The rest comes later." Claire was quiet for a beat. Then she asked softly, "And what if the rest never comes?" Ethan shrugged. "Then you still did the right thing. That counts." She looked at him, something shifting in her expression. Admiration, perhaps. Or respect. Maybe both. "You're a strange man, Ethan Miller. I hear that a lot," he said, grinning. They both laughed, and for the first time it wasn't strained. Claire felt her shoulders relax. Back inside, Margaret and Noah had finished their drawing. It showed a robot kneeling in a garden planting seeds beneath a sky stitched with stars. It was simple and imperfect, but it carried a depth neither of them could fully explain. Claire stood in the doorway and watched them. Watched how her mother gently brushed Noah's curls away from his eyes. How the boy leaned into her without hesitation. It stirred something inside Claire, a pang, yes, but also a pull. Margaret noticed her and smiled. "Want to help us finish the last page?" Claire hesitated. "I haven't drawn in years." Margaret offered her the pencil. "Then you're overdue." She sat, slowly, took the pencil, and began to sketch hesitantly at first, then with a growing confidence. The picture they created together was of the robot, older, now dented in places, standing under the moonlight beside a tree. The same swing from the earlier pages hung from one of its branches. A child was asleep at the base, and the robot stood watch its hand gently resting on the child's shoulder. No words, just feeling. When they were done, Claire leaned back and stared at it. "It's not perfect. Nothing good ever is," Margaret said. That night, as the last of the sunlight dipped below the hills, Ethan stood by the back porch looking up at the sky. Claire joined him, arms crossed over her chest, quiet for a long while. "You said earlier," she began, "that you show up first." "I did." "Well." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you did. For her. For me. For Noah." He looked at her and nodded once. "Me too." In the stillness, a breeze stirred the trees, and in that moment Claire felt something lift. Not all the weight, not all the pain, but enough, just enough to stay, just enough to hope. It was past midnight when Ethan woke to the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. At first he thought it might have been the wind. Wyoming spring nights were notorious for sudden gusts. But the second thud was unmistakable, sharp, human. He swung his legs over the bed and was halfway down the hallway when Noah's bedroom door creaked open behind him. "Dad." "It's okay, buddy," Ethan said quickly. "Go back to sleep." But his voice didn't hide the edge in it, and Noah knew better than to ask twice. Ethan turned the corner into the small hallway between the kitchen and bathroom, and there, on the cold tile floor, Margaret lay crumpled, one hand still reaching for the bathroom light switch. "Margaret," he dropped beside her. Her eyes fluttered open, clouded and distant. Her lips moved, but no sound came. "Don't try to talk," Ethan said gently. "You hit your head. I'm calling an ambulance." She reached up weakly, fingers brushing his sleeve. "No. No hospital. Just dizzy." Ethan's voice dropped. "You need to be checked out. That's not negotiable." She didn't fight him. Claire was already down the stairs when the paramedics arrived. Her hair was a mess of loose strands, and worry her face pale in the porch light. She stood frozen as they loaded her mother onto the stretcher, but when Margaret reached for her hand, she clutched it like she might lose her again. "I'll ride with her," Claire told Ethan, her voice shaky but resolute. "I'll meet you there." It was nearly 3 a.m. by the time Ethan parked outside the emergency entrance. Noah had fallen asleep in the back seat, curled beneath his coat like a kitten. Ethan carried him inside, where a kind nurse offered a blanket and a seat in the waiting room. Claire emerged from a double door just as Ethan was settling in. "She's stable," she said softly. "Dehydration, low blood sugar." And her blood pressure dropped when she stood too fast. "They're keeping her for observation." Ethan nodded, the tension in his chest easing just slightly. "Is she awake?" Claire nodded. "She asked for you?" He blinked, surprised. "I think she wants you to hear something." Ethan handed Noah's sleeping form to the nurse and followed Claire through the quiet hall. The room Margaret occupied was small and dimly lit, monitors blinking quietly beside her. She looked fragile, even smaller than usual, swallowed by the hospital bed. But when she saw Ethan, her eyes lit up. "I didn't want to scare him," she whispered. "You scared all of us," Ethan said gently, pulling up a chair. Claire stood at the door, not intruding, but listening. "I didn't eat all day," Margaret admitted. "I was afraid if I sat down with Claire I'd say the wrong thing. So I stayed on my feet, baking, cleaning, thinking." Ethan took her hand. "You don't have to explain." "I do," she said, "because you're the reason I had the courage to reach out to her." He looked down embarrassed. "I didn't do anything." Margaret squeezed his fingers. "You did everything. You gave me a place where I could be. You didn't demand anything. You let me come undone without judgment." She turned to Claire, "And because of him I remembered who I used to be. Before I was afraid. Before I hid behind silence." Claire stepped inside, now closer, her arms crossed against the chill in the room. Margaret looked between them. "There's something you both should know." Ethan raised his eyebrows. Margaret took a breath. "Years ago, after Claire left, I couldn't face what happened, but I also couldn't live with myself. I went to see a lawyer, drew up something I never told anyone about." Claire frowned. "What kind of something?" "A second trust," Margaret said. "One that bypassed Kyle completely. I didn't tell him. I didn't even fund it all at once, just slowly, quietly. It's modest compared to what he got, but it's mine, and I kept the documents in a safety deposit box along with a letter." Claire's eyes narrowed. "What kind of letter?" Margaret looked at Ethan. "A letter to you, Claire. One I never sent." The room was silent. Claire's voice came soft, cautious. "Why now? Because I nearly died tonight," Margaret said, not melodramatic, just honest. "And if I had, I don't want my last act on this earth to be silence. Not again." Claire stepped to the edge of the bed. "Where is it?" Margaret fumbled weakly under her pillow and pulled out a small, tarnished key. "Wells, Fargo. Main branch. Box 1326. Claire took the key, her fingers trembling. She stared at it as if it weighed more than gold. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Margaret smiled. "Then don't say anything. Just take the first step." Ethan stood and kissed Margaret's forehead gently. "Get some rest. I'll take Claire in the morning." Claire looked at him with new eyes. "Why are you helping us?" He tilted his head. "Because helping is the only thing that ever made sense to me." They left the hospital, quietly stepping into the early dawn. Light was just beginning to stretch across the parking lot, brushing the edge of the horizon with lavender. In the car, Claire looked out the window, then finally said, "My mother used to say, nothing good ever happens after midnight." Ethan started the engine. Maybe she's wrong. Claire turned to him. Maybe she said. Or maybe something good finally did. The sun had barely risen when Claire found herself standing in the downtown branch of Wells Fargo, the worn brass key Margaret had given her warm in her palm. The air inside the bank was crisp and sterile, but her pulse felt loud in her ears, too loud for the quiet lobby, too loud for the sleepy woman behind the counter who barely blinked as she checked the key and led Claire to the vault. A second later, the safety deposit box was in front of her. Plain. Unremarkable. But it might as well have been the lockbox of her entire childhood. She opened it with a slow, deliberate breath. Inside was a sealed envelope with her name written in careful, familiar script and a brown file folder with a small blue ribbon tied neatly around the middle. Her fingers trembled as she picked them up. The envelope smelled faintly of lavender, like the sachets Margaret used to keep in the linen closet. She sat at the small privacy table, peeled back the flap of the envelope, and began to read. "My Claire. If you're reading this, then maybe. I finally found the courage I never had when you were 16. Maybe life broke me down enough to make room for something honest, something whole. I can't undo what I didn't do. I can't go back and believe you when I should have. But I can tell you now as clearly as I know how I believe you. I believe you with every cell in my body, and I am sorry beyond what any apology can hold. I gave everything to your brother thinking I owed him for staying. But it turns out the one I owed most was the one I drove away. You. So this small thing, this trust is not a bribe. It's not an attempt to buy back time. It's a thank you for surviving, a recognition of your strength. It's me finally truly saying I see you, and I am proud of you. If I never get the chance to say it face to face, then let this letter be my voice in the room. Let it tell you that you were right, that you mattered, that you still do. Love, Mom. Claire's breath caught. A tear rolled down her cheek before she could stop it. She read the letter again twice before she opened the file folder. Inside were notarized documents, the establishment of a private trust under Claire's name dated almost 15 years ago with incremental deposits made over time. The balance was noted in a recent bank summary, $1.8 million. Claire's heart skipped. She wasn't a stranger to money. She had built her own firm from the ground up. She'd managed portfolios larger than this, but this wasn't just money. It was proof. It was a seed planted in silence, grown in guilt, but meant for something more. It was love in the only language her mother had known how to speak for years, provision, care, sacrifice. And this time it had come with the words she had needed most. They didn't talk on the ride home. Ethan knew better. He let the silence breathe, let her process. She sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, clutching the folder like it might vanish. When they reached the house, Margaret was already home from the hospital, resting on the couch with Noah curled up beside her, flipping through a book of state birds. Her face still carried a touch of pale exhaustion, but her eyes lit up when Claire walked in. Claire didn't speak at first. She crossed the room, slowly sat on the coffee table, and looked her mother straight in the eyes. "I read it," she said softly. "The letter. The documents. All of it." Margaret nodded, her throat working as she tried to speak. "I meant every word. I know Claire said, and I needed to hear them more than I realized." She reached for her mother's hand. "Thank you for seeing me." Margaret's eyes brimmed. "You're the strongest person I've ever known." Claire smiled through her tears. "I had to be." They sat that way, hand in hand, across the chasm that had once seemed impossible to cross. Now, somehow it felt less like a canyon and more like a bridge. Ethan stood by the doorway, watching the moment unfold with quiet reverence. He turned away to give them privacy, but not before Margaret called softly, "Ethan." He turned. "There's one more thing I need your help with." That afternoon, the three adults sat at the kitchen table, papers spread out before them. Margaret spoke first. "I want to use part of the trust, what's left, to start something here. Something that outlives me." Claire looked up. "You don't have to. That's yours." Margaret shook her head. "It's never really been about money. It's about making something right. There are kids in this town who slip through the cracks, families that fall apart quietly the way we did. I want to build something that helps them hold on." Ethan leaned forward. "What are you thinking?" Margaret glanced at Claire. "A foundation, scholarships, art programs, support for single parents. Something built on kindness, something that says, 'We see you.'" Claire exhaled slowly. "I know someone who can help us structure it properly. I'll drop the paperwork." Noah walked in just then, holding a stack of drawings. "Can we call it The House Behind the Tracks?" he asked. "Like in the storybook." Margaret looked at him, her heart full. "That sounds perfect." Ethan smiled. "I'll handle the plumbing." Everyone laughed softly at first, then louder, fuller. It was the sound of something breaking open, something deep and long held joy. Later that night, Claire stood in the backyard looking up at the stars. Ethan joined her, quietly, hands in his pockets. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Better than I've been in a long time." He paused. "You know, most people spend years trying to get their parents to see them. You did something even harder. You saw her too." Claire looked over at him. You really think people can change? Ethan didn't hesitate. I think the moment you believe they can't, you close the door on something beautiful. She turned fully toward him now, studying him in the moonlight. You're a good man, Ethan Miller. He smiled. I try. She stepped closer, not touching, just near. Thank you for everything. And then, after a breath, she said the thing she hadn't let herself hope for. Would you stay? He didn't answer right away. But when he did, it was the simplest thing in the world. I already have. Margaret stood on the porch wrapped in a shawl Claire had brought from Casper, a soft woven blend of sky blue and earth gray. The morning sun touched the front of the house with a warm gentleness, as if it too understood that something sacred had happened here and didn't want to disturb it. Across the street, Ethan was helping an elderly veteran unload a trunk full of donated school supplies. Noah sat on the steps humming to himself and drawing a logo for what he now proudly called the House Project. Claire emerged from the house holding a folder tucked under her arm. She looked rested, but more than that lighter, like a woman who had laid down a burden she'd carried too long. Margaret turned to her. Did the paperwork go through? Claire smiled, filed and approved. As of this morning, the Whitmore Family Foundation is officially recognized as a nonprofit entity in the state of Wyoming. Margaret exhaled her hand over her heart. I never thought I'd live to see something good come from all of it. Claire stepped beside her. Sometimes we have to walk through fire before we can light the way for someone else. They watched Ethan laugh with the veteran gently moving boxes as though they weighed nothing at all. Margaret's voice was quiet. He reminds me of your father. The version I wish he had been. Claire looked down at her feet. I stopped believing men like Ethan existed. I stopped believing I deserved to meet one. Margaret replied. Claire turned. Do you think he knows how much he's changed all of us? I think Margaret said he'd say he didn't do anything special. That's how you know it's real. Later that afternoon, the kitchen table became the planning hub for what would become the first community project under the Foundation's wing, a Saturday art program for kids in the local foster system. Margaret would teach watercolor. Claire would handle the legal structure and logistics. Ethan had offered the garage space for hosting the sessions until they could afford a real studio. Noah named it Brush and Belong. Ethan grinned when he heard it. Catchy. It has to be. Noah said, kids need to feel like they belong the second they walk in the door. Claire looked at him, eyes soft. You're going to make a great man someday. Noah beamed. I've got good examples. Margaret watched them, a warmth blooming in her chest that had nothing to do with the cup of tea in her hands. For the first time in years, she felt part of something not by title, not by obligation, but by heart. As the sun began to lower, casting golden light across the worn floorboards of the house, Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked at Claire. You're staying. The question was simple. No pressure, no expectation. Claire met his gaze. Not just staying. I'm building something here. Their eyes held for a long moment. Later that night, the house was quiet. Margaret sat in the living room with a thick journal in her lap, one she had never dared to start until now. Across the room, Claire dozed off on the couch with a book open across her chest. In the corner, Noah had fallen asleep with crayons still in his hand, the paper beside him filled with a drawing of a tree, a swing, and 3 stick figures beneath it. Ethan stood at the doorway watching them. His heart was full in a way he hadn't known was possible outside of fatherhood. He walked quietly toward Margaret and crouched beside her chair. You all right? He asked. She smiled. I'm more than all right. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment until Margaret whispered, You saved me. Ethan. He shook his head. No, I just didn't walk away. She reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly steady. Sometimes that's the same thing. The next morning, Claire woke early and brewed the coffee. She stepped outside to find Ethan fixing the porch railing again. He looked up, smiled. Thought you weren't a morning person. I'm learning new things about myself. she said, leaning on the post beside him. Like how good it feels to stop running. He nodded. You're good at staying. I had to be, she said. For her. And now, maybe for me too. They stood there for a while, the kind of silence that feels less like nothing and more like everything. Then Claire turned to him. I've been thinking, she said. About what's next? Ethan paused, waiting. I want to invest some of the trust into the foundation, yes, but I also want to renovate this house, turn the back lot into a community garden, maybe even build a permanent studio space. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That's a lot of work, Claire smiled. Lucky I know a man who's good with his hands. He chuckled. You planning to pay him in cobbler and iced tea? She stepped closer. No, she said. I plan to thank him every day. Her hand brushed his fingers, curling gently around his palm. His grip closed around hers, firm and warm. And in that touch, quiet and deliberate, something unspoken passed between them. Not a confession, not a promise, but a recognition. Of what had been built here. Of what was still growing. Of how a broken home had become a sanctuary. Not because it was perfect, but because the people inside had chosen to heal. Together. And outside, the house stood tall behind the tracks just as it always had. But now it had a name, a purpose, and finally, a future. Autumn came early that year. The air in the small Wyoming town turned crisp before September had fully arrived, and the maples along the narrow streets blushed red and gold like they were holding their breath for something beautiful. At the edge of town, behind the old railroad tracks, the once weathered house stood taller, brighter. A fresh coat of paint covered the siding, white with dark green trim. New planters lined the porch railing, each one filled by children's hands with petunias and marigolds. The yard was tidy, but more than that, it was lived in loved. A hand-carved sign hung from a post at the front gate. The house where goodness lives inside. Laughter rang through the kitchen. Okay, who spilled glitter in the pancake batter? Ethan asked, grinning at the sparkly swirl in the mixing bowl. Noah raised his hand sheepishly. It was for the art box, but the lid came off. Claire, seated at the table with two neighborhood girls working on self-portraits, chuckled. Looks like we'll have sparkly waffles today. Margaret wiped her hands on a towel and leaned against the doorway, watching the scene with eyes full of quiet awe. She had never imagined this kind of life at her age, one not defined by regret, but by redemption. The Brush and Belong Saturday program had grown faster than anyone expected. What started with a folding table in the garage had become a hub of color and creativity. Children from all walks of life came each week to draw, to paint, to speak through images when words were too fragile. Parents lingered longer after drop-off now. Some asked about volunteering. Others simply stayed for coffee on the porch, grateful for a place that made everyone feel seen. Margaret stepped outside with a tray of mugs. Claire followed, and the two sat together on the steps, the morning sun warming their backs. You know, Claire said, I used to think a house was just a structure, something you escaped from or bought your way into. But this place, it's more than that. Margaret smiled. Because of what we built here. Claire nodded. Because of who we became here. They sat in silence for a moment, the good kind. The kind filled with understanding, not absence. Margaret reached over, placed a hand gently over her daughter's. Thank you for giving me the chance to be better. You chose to be better, Claire replied. You just finally let someone witness it. Inside, Ethan called out waffles and 5 glitter optional. Claire laughed. We should go save the kitchen. Margaret shook her head. Let them make a mess. That's how good things start. Later that afternoon, they gathered beneath the large oak tree in the backyard. A new bench had been added there with a small plaque that read, In honor of second chances. Noah climbed into Ethan's lap, showing him a new drawing, a robot with a heart bigger than its chest arms, wide open, surrounded by children. His name is Mend Noah, explained proudly. Because he doesn't fix machines, he fixes people. Ethan met Claire's gaze across the bench, and she smiled. "I think he looks familiar," she teased. Margaret leaned her head against the backrest. "We should frame that one. We should frame a lot of things Ethan said, like the moment this house stopped being broken." Claire nodded, and became something sacred. As the sun began its descent, casting soft amber light through the leaves, they remained there together, 3 generations imperfect and healing. Margaret stood eventually moving with slow but steady steps and went inside. She returned with something wrapped in cloth, an old worn book. She handed it to Noah. "It's our storybook," she said, "the one you and I started that first week." Noah's eyes widened. "You kept it?" Margaret nodded. "And I finished the last page." Noah unwrapped it carefully. The final drawing showed the robot standing before a small house tucked behind railroad tracks, its arms around a boy, a woman, and an older lady with silver hair. Above them in the sky were words written in delicate script. "Here lives the kindness that changed everything." Noah looked up, blinking hard. "It's us." "It always was," she said. Ethan reached over and rested a hand on Margaret's shoulder, steady and sure. Claire's eyes glistening whispered, "That's the best ending I've ever read." Margaret smiled. "It's not an ending, sweetheart. It's just a beautiful new beginning." Even as twilight fell and the crickets began their soft chorus, no one moved right away. There was nothing urgent pulling them, no unfinished conversation, just the quiet contentment of being exactly where they were meant to be. And when the porch light flicked on, casting a soft glow across the front yard and illuminating the sign that now welcomed the whole town to come, the house didn't just look like a home, it felt like hope. A place reborn not from wealth or design, but from simple acts of goodness held together by truth, trust, and love. The kind of love that doesn't arrive with fanfare, but with open doors. And the kind of healing that starts not when someone says, "I forgive you," but when someone decides to stay, even when they don't have to. Especially then. Where are you watching from? We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Drop a comment and let us know your thoughts on today's story. If this touched your heart or reminded you of the power of kindness, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing family of story lovers. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep believing in the good.